1, 2, 3, testing. That's all.
But they're free tonight.
Yes, it's free.
Nobody will ask him to do anything.
That's right, that's right. I'm not gonna call on you to come up and sing or anything.
Absolutely.
The clock on the wall says it's time for us to begin, so we'd like to do that. Let's start with a very genuine welcome to everyone. Thanks for coming. You're going to have a real treat this evening. I'm looking forward to this presentation, The Splendor of Egypt. But before we get to that, let me just remind ourselves and any guests that we have who we are and why we meet every month. We call ourselves the Becker Adult Fellowship. We meet regularly, usually on the third Friday of the month. We have a good time. We try to have a variety of different things on our program. For example, in June we were go-karting and miniature golf. July we were up at the lake. I think about 35 of us drove up to Cross Lake and spent the day there. In August, we call it the corn feed. It's really the pig out because we not only have corn, we had the best potluck picnic anywhere. There was too much food, but we took care of most of it. Here we are in September, getting a little more academic here, but that's the variety. Next month, of course, is food. We're going to do a
Food again.
Progressive supper. November, we've got a missionary report. December, we've got a Christmas program lined up. Those are the kinds of things that we like to do. Good seats in the front here if anybody. Let's not set up any more chairs in the back. We want good seats in the front.
Let's not set up any more chairs.
I would like to, at this time, introduce our program, The Splendor of Egypt. Bob and Alice North had the real privilege and in the enviable position last December to make that journey to Egypt. I remember 8th grade geography, and the title of that chapter was Egypt, the Land of the Nile. I've forgotten all the rest of that chapter. We're going to get a review of that this evening. Would you help me to welcome Bob and Alice North?
Try your microphone here.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
And can you hear me if I talk like this?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, the splendor of Egypt. It captivated all our senses. It was unlike anything we had ever seen. The world seems fascinated with the pyramids, the mummies, the Sphinx. But there's so much more. It's a window to mankind's past, and we're really anxious to show you.
The ancient Egyptians settled along the fertile banks of the Nile and established a magnificent and enduring culture that has lasted 5,000 years, in spite of being captured by the Persians, Greeks, Romans, the Crusaders, the Arabs, and the Turks. We found Egypt a rich land of contrast. There was a fertile Nile Valley
Versus the harsh Arabian desert.
the small 7th century Arabian farming villages,
And the modern city of Cairo,
the Egyptian Christian churches,
in the midst of an Islamic nation. And there were progressive women in education, nursing, business, and politics in a democratic but Islamic police state.
and the unexpected natural hospitality and warmth we felt from the Egyptian people.
Hieroglyphics is the oldest writing system known to man, and it means the sacred carved letters. We couldn't learn to read the hieroglyphics because it's based on the sounds of a lost Egyptian language. But here is the phrase, Egypt with the North, thanks to the internet.
Okay, we'll just pause for a minute and let these people be seated. We flew into Cairo, which is up on top up here, and we went all the way down to the bottom of here. You can't even see it hardly. The Aswan Dam was way down at the bottom there. So that was our basic whole trip. We started out our adventure with the pyramids of Giza, just outside of Cairo. And we met our Egyptian guide, Farak, and he was our guide for the 9 of us, alone for the whole trip. Now here's a drawing of the Giza Plateau, which was 1 mile by 2 miles in size. And this royal burial ground is like a small town. It contains the Pharaoh's pyramids, which are these big ones. And it has the Queen's pyramids, these little ones. And it has a little building over here where they did the mummification of the people. All of these little ones are what they call mastabas. They were a precursor to the actual pyramid. The pyramids were one of the only survivors of the ancient 7 wonders of the world. The Sphinx is called the Father of Terror. He was the earliest known monument and stands guard over the Giza Plateau. As you can see in this next slide now, his feet are actually the feet of lions.
Go ahead.
Okay, right. Okay, Tammy, you got that one more. Right there, you can see his feet of lions. But one of the pharaohs decided to redo it in his image, so it has a human face.
Let us take you back 5,000 years to see what happened at the Giza Plaza, or the royal burial ground. When a king or queen died, they were taken by boat down the Nile to their little temple, that little building in the front. These temples and pyramids were prepared in advance, according to the king's specifications. Inside the little temple, the embalmers made the king into a mummy. It was a 70-day process. It was believed that if the mummification was done correctly, and if the priest said all the right prayers, the king would have a continued existence or a resurrection. They had no concept of hell. Their sarcophagus was also made in advance, and the sarcophagus was to symbolize the mother's womb. The mummification process began by removing all the soft organs from the body through small incisions. They even removed the brain through the nose. They sterilized the organs and preserved them, put them in resin, and stored them in these alabaster jars, canoptic jars. A mummy or a body had to have all the parts available in the tomb, otherwise they wouldn't resurrect. The empty body was then packed with spices, the equivalent of baking soda and table salt, until it was sterilized and dehydrated. Embalming was a prized art. When the body was dehydrated, it was wrapped in cotton, 7 layers, covered with a clear resin-like to keep the moisture out, put in the sarcophagus, covered with gold oftentimes, and put to rest in the pyramids. The pyramids contained chutes pointing up to the stars, so the spirit of the person could get out, or so the sun god could get down into the pyramid.
Okay, let's summarize now what we know about the pyramids without reading that whole screen. There are about 90 pyramids, the stone tombs of the pharaohs on the west banks of the Nile. Each side is a perfect triangle, and they covered it with white limestone, and it looked like rays of the sun. Besides the mummies in these pyramids, there were paintings and drawings of what the king had done in his lifetime. And personal items of the pharaoh were stored with him in case the king would need them in his afterlife. It's hard to imagine the size of the Great Pyramid. No, they couldn't move it. The base covers 13 and a half acres. Can you believe that? Just the base of the pyramid. And it's 756 feet tall. Now, here we are standing at an entryway to the Great Pyramid, and we're dwarfed by the size of it. Contrary to popular belief, Egyptologists now believe that countless workmen helped build the pyramids, not slaves. Behind the supporting structures, they found the names of work crews and hieroglyphics. It's now believed that the pyramids were like a national construction project like our WPA. When the Nile overflowed, the farmers needed work, so it was an economic solution.
The precursor to the pyramids was the mastaba. It was called the Mound of Creation, or Portal of Heaven. It was believed the sun helped the person to be reborn from these mounds. Mastabas were stacked into step pyramids. Imhotep designed them to look like wedding cakes. Eventually, the steps were filled in with white limestone to make the pyramids like we first saw.
Get up.
Our family taking off to view the pyramids on camels.
Okay, our next stop and last stop at the Giza Plateau was the Solar Boat Museum. This housed one of the 5 original solar boats that the king and his family were to use to carry them into the afterlife. Each of the 5 boats was found in a crypt made of stone that was 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, and 100 feet long. They painstakingly rebuilt one of these boats, one board at a time from the original parts. Now these are the primitive tools that were originally used to build the boat, and a little sample of a boat in the middle. The boats were made, listen, from linen and boards. The linen tightened when it was wet, and the boards expanded, making a watertight seal. Now this is the actual reconstructed 5,000-year-old solar boat. It was believed once in the heavens, the king would still protect his empire on earth. The Egyptians believed the kings were half human and half God.
In contrast, right next to the pyramids, we have the modern city of Cairo. Here's a view of the pyramids from our hotel window. Most city dwellers lived in stacked apartments. Notice every building is of the same color because it's sandblasted from the desert winds. Every apartment seems to have a dish, so the Egyptians have contact with the world by way of TV.
Now, going through traffic was truly hair-raising. The boys would have thought it was great fun, like playing a video game. One outstanding difference between the Egyptian culture and ours is that Egypt does not allow credit. So everything is paid for up front. They've never heard of house payments or interest. In Cairo, there are a number, okay, go ahead, Rick. I'm sorry.
In Cairo, there are a number of international hotels. Security is like at an airport because there are people from all over the world. So there are scanners everywhere. They don't want any problems. It seems so many things in Egypt are so artfully done. Here is our hotel swimming pool, can you believe? And an outdoor restaurant
Overlooking
the Nile.
Okay, next we flew downstream to Luxor. Now this was formerly called Thebes, and it was once the capital of ancient Egypt. Here we will see the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, many temples and tombs. In Luxor, the horse-drawn carriages share the streets with the cars. The Old Testament talks about how powerful and proud Thebes was, and how it conquered the Israelites when they turned from the living God.
The first temple we'll see is the Luxor Temple, known as in Egyptian language as the Southern Harem. It's still a site of the fertility festival. It is believed their king was reborn as the son of sun god Amun here. The next 10 pictures show highlights of the temple Luxor. It's important to remember that the common man did not come to the temple to worship. They had statues of gods they worshipped in their own homes. Only priests and gods resided in the temples. The common folk came here for festivals. They even brought in gods from other temples during down the Nile for these festivals. This is an example of pharaonic architecture. This temple was dedicated to the Egyptian gods. Remember that the ancient Egyptians saw their kings as half gods. So we have Ramses II with an 82-foot tall obelisk that told of all his military accomplishments. The Luxor temple was connected to Karnak, our next temple, with 2 miles of sphinxes like this. At the night show, we saw Osiris, the god of the Egyptian underworld, between the pillars. and long colonnades of papyrus and lotus columns. And this is a close-up of Ramesses II. Many of the carved reliefs show the blending of papyrus and lotus, exemplifying the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. A close-up of Osiris, the god of the underworld. He had a human face which was blue because it was believed he was mummified. It was in Luxor that we first saw evidence of the early Christians. Mark, who they call Saint Mark, is credited with bringing Christianity to Egypt. It was said the Egyptians were accepting of Christianity early because their tendency to believe in afterlife and the virgin birth. As you know, the early Christians were persecuted under Roman rule. Many fled to Egypt and hid out in the temples and tombs. In many of the temples, we saw the faces of the Egyptian gods scratched out or covered with plaster and paintings of Jesus and his disciples, like this one.
Okay, next we went on to the Temple of Karnak, and this is connected to Luxor by a 2-mile path of sphinxes on each side of the path. It covers 247 acres. It's the largest temple ever built by man and represents the achievements of generations of pharaohs and builders. Here we see, in this column here, a hall with 243 columns. Again, we see Ramses II at the entrance. Notice the size of the small queen in front of you. Again, part of the 2 miles of sphinxes that were connecting Karnak and the Temple of Luxor. Okay, for a while, one of the pharaohs deemed there was only one god, Amun-Ra. Karnak was the home of the god Amun and his priests. The priests carried out the pharaoh's wishes, arranged for festivals, and sometimes even answered the people's questions. They bathed in the sacred lake and performed all the religious rituals. They bathed, dressed, and fed the gods. Almost every surface was covered with beautiful colored relief carvings and hieroglyphics inside and outside the buildings. This is a hall of budding papyrus columns. Hypostyle hall. This was interesting. The 3 temples at Karnak were laid out like the temples in Jerusalem. A large outer court for festivals and celebrations, an inner court for the elite, and a final room where only the priests could go. Now, the one pharaoh who deemed there was only one god, Amun, was destroyed, as was his idea. However, Karnak remained the home of the god Amun. But yet there are many gods pictured here because it took 100 years to build Karnak, so many of the different gods from these pharaohs showed up on the walls. These are the papyrus columns, again, connecting many of the temple's rooms. And this is outside of Karnak at the night light show. And this was the sacred lake of Amun, where the priests bathed. We saw this as we left the night show at Karnak.
Remember, the pyramids were on the west side of the Nile? Well, so were the Valley of Kings and Queens. The reason the tombs were on the west side of the Nile was that it symbolized the end of light, like the setting of the sun in the west. So this little shuttle took us over to the West Bank. About 1,000 years after the pyramids were built, it was decided the pyramids of mastabas were not a safe place to bury kings and queens because of grave robbers. So the Valley of the Kings was chosen because it was hidden in a treacherous limestone valley with sheer cliffs of sheer rock. The huge statues of Menon, the sun god, and his mother, the Colossi of Menon, guarded the Valley of the Kings. 63 tombs have been found, but in modern times the valley became famous because of the discovery of King Tut, or King Tutankhamun's tomb. The outside of the tombs were originally inconspicuous, but somehow the grave robbers got in and left nothing but the empty tombs. Even though I heard on TV tonight the grave robbers were tortured and impaled if they were caught grave robbers with graves. When one entered a tomb or a pyramid, there was a long descending hallway with a turn to the right usually. The purpose was so the sun god could get down into the underworld to the burial chamber, and so the spirit of the buried king could get out. Someone else suggested it aqua size. Well, maybe it was so the workmen could get out too. When we got to the burial chamber, one encountered a huge gold leaf box like this. There might be several smaller boxes inside that one. Inside that was the sarcophagus, or the coffin. Note all the relief carvings on the walls and the ceilings.
Okay, now this is quite a chart here, and when you look inside the tombs, every character is part of a word, group, or story. The kings have crowns, which you see down in the corner here, and the gods always have the key to life, which you'll see here, and you'll see the gods carrying it in their hands when they're meeting the pharaohs. And this is the god Osiris that we have here. So hieroglyphics, as we have said, is known as the sacred carved letters, and the Egyptians used them to express their religious beliefs and cover almost every available surface of the tomb. But it wasn't until a dictionary was found on the stone called the Rosetta Stone in the 1800s that the hieroglyphics could actually be translated. Inside the tombs are many colorful reliefs and hieroglyphics of the ancient gods and funerary literature. Okay, now instead of trying to confuse you with the names of 30 gods, we thought it would be helpful to classify them according to purpose. First, there were the gods of creation, sky, the sun, the waters, and the earth.
Second, there were gods for beauty, love, fertility, women, childbirth, and for the protection of women and children.
Third, there were gods who were responsible for the cause and cure of disease, snakes, scorpions, demons, and war.
And fourth, the Egyptians seemed obsessed with their afterlife, and there were gods protecting the embalming mummy process, their sarcophagus, in the cemeteries.
Finally, there was one god of interest to most of the scholars, and his name was Thoth, T-H-O-T-H, the moon god of wisdom. He was an ibis with a crescent moon over his head, and we see that crescent moon over every Islamic mosque today. Thoth, the god of wisdom, saw over writing, time, weight, measures, mathematics, and learning. He held scribes' tools in his hands. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar which orders Muslim religious life.
Remember the solar boat we saw at Giza, used to get the pharaoh to afterlife? And also remember that pharaohs were half god, Horus, a falcon, and half man? Well, here he is with his servants finding his way through the underworld. And on the wall are hieroglyphics or funerary literature. The Book of the Dead, or the funerary literature, has over 100 compositions on afterlife. Its purpose is to guide the spirit of the deceased person in his passage to the afterlife. It told of the dead how to cope with the afterlife and what symbolic steps he had to take to get there.
Okay, now this was another wall and another tomb, and you can see in their heaven, Horus is seen as a winged desk overseeing the tomb. On the upper level we see the solar boats in here. Below we have the god of the underworld and judgment, disease, and mummification. If you see a pharaoh with a red helmet or red king crown, it means he's a king from Lower Egypt.
On this tomb wall, on the right is the god of the underworld, Osiris. He was the supreme judge of the dead. Pictured as a mummy with a blue face and a white crown, he held a scepter and veil in his hand. The king from Lower Egypt, the red crowned on the left, is presenting himself to the supreme judge of the dead. We notice that when people talk to their gods, they always have their hands held out in front of them.
Okay, now the jackal-headed god was called Anubis, and he was the protector of the cemetery and presided over embalming and mummification. A pharaoh was meeting him here in the underworld, and it said the jackal actually weighed the heart of the deceased pharaoh. If he had a big heart, he got more rewards and punishment. On the wall, notice the oval cartouches. These are called cartouches. The names of the people buried there were written on the cartouches, and the little walls around the outside of that semicircle or circle were there to protect their names.
In another tomb, we find the cobra god, which was a symbol of Lower Egypt, and they are watching over the dead. And this is an example of text from the Book of the Dead. Some of the topics covered were the rewards and punishments to be expected, how to pass through each hour of the night or each gate of the night, and what to expect in the underworld. They didn't realize that the sun went around the world. They thought the sun went through the gates, through underneath of the temples.
Okay, in between the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, there's a little village which was occupied in the past by royal artists who carved and decorated the royal tombs. This ancient village was called Medina. Now here's two of the kids from the village that were selling handmade dolls. All the Egyptians we met were respectful, and we felt a natural warm hospitality. We learned the Muslims believe they are earning points towards heaven every time they are helpful or teach somebody something, but they really never know if they earned enough points to get to heaven.
One of the most outstanding temples we saw was that of Hatshepsut, and it was built in about 1500 BC, and it's the foot at the limestone cliff. She's one of my favorite people. Anyway, Egyptians believe, and the NIV concurs, that it was Hatshepsut who was the favorite Pharaoh's daughter that took baby Moses from the Nile. Hatshepsut married her half-brother, who was a pharaoh. He died quite young, and Hatshepsut became pharaoh. The temple was not in the Valley of Kings, but it had a pathway to it. Nor is it in the Valley of the Queens. I believe the Egyptians didn't know quite what to do with this lady they must have had mixed emotions about her, because here she is suckled by the god of love, pleasure, and beauty, which could either be human or calf form, Hathor. And there, a little wall, on another wall, they depicted her in the traditional pharaoh's costume, with a beard and with her hair all covered up. And here's Hathor. Oh.
Yeah, would you go on, Tammy?
Oops, sorry.
There she is, as the lady pharaoh depicted with a beard and a crown and her hair all covered up. But yet they had the goddess of love, beauty, and pleasure all over her temple. Hatshepsut was highly regarded, and she reigned 30-some years. Her tomb was decorated equally as beautiful as the other pharaohs, even though she was not in the Valley of the Kings. Notice the winged solar god responsible for creation of life.
Then we went to the Valley of the Queens. There were 70 tombs which have been found there, but most of them have been destroyed. Because they are between cliffs, many were flooded, and travelers used them to house camels and donkeys, and here we are standing in front of the Valley of the Queens.
One of the most impressive tombs in the Valley of the Queens was Nefertiti's. And here are some female gods: Isis, goddess of love, pure, ideal mother and spouse. And she was also said to have magical powers, and I think she still has some cults today. Nefertiti is in front of this god of wisdom. In the Valley of the Queens were also the tombs of children. Here King Ramses is introducing his prince son to the god of air. Feather-bearing was an honor only allowed royal family members. There are a few things about art. Back up a minute, would you, Dan? There are a few things about art that I noticed. See how the bodies are facing sideways, but yet the shoulders are facing front? And also the faces are facing front, but the faces are facing sideways, but the eyes are facing front.
Okay, go on, Tammy.
Otherwise, their art was beautiful. The color.
Why that was though?
Why?
It was depicted that they wanted to make them the most positive part of the image. If you had the body straight on, it wasn't nearly as attractive as the body turned to the side, and the shoulders presented bigger if they were at an angle. And you saw the best features of the nose and the
now, as we were leaving the Valley of the Queens, we had to walk a gauntlet of vendors. They have the same cheap stuff there as they had any other place. And then, here we are with there's our guide for Oak, and if you didn't realize it, the 9 of us had our own guide the whole trip. And we had not planned on that. We had our own little mini bus and just had a great time. Okay, then we got across the Nile and we boarded our boat for the Nile cruise. At Luxor, we boarded one of 300 plus river boats that were on the Nile. We were on the Royal Ruby. Tourism is an important source of income for Egypt, but in 1997, the brutal murder of 58 tourists almost stopped tourism. But Egypt has tightened the security now, and they are much, much safer. Anyway, last year, they had 8 million visitors, and we always felt perfectly safe. Now, to get to our boat, we had to walk through those boats that were stacked up, exactly at the same level. And it was fun to see how each decorated for Christmas.
Outside our dining room was a Coptic or Egyptian Christian church made like a gingerbread house for Christmas. Isn't it cute? It was fun to see how the Egyptians visualized Christmas. Most of the manger scenes were placed in large paper mache caves right down the bottoms. And the mangers, and Jesus and Mary and Joseph were put in those.
Okay, now getting back to our rooms, we never knew what to expect. Go on, Sam. Our giggling cattle boys loved to surprise us with whatever they could make out of the towels, and they would take our glasses or anything else they could find. And, whoops, could this be a pharaoh?
Egypt was called the gift of the Nile, because without the river, the whole country would be barren desert. In ancient times, a great wealthy civilization flourished along the riverbanks, and the incredible wealth of the temples and the tombs came from taxes on the grain raised on the rich flood land.
The Nile is central to life today as it was to the farmers and fishermen depicted in the pharaoh's tombs. For thousands of years, the annual flooding deposited fresh fertilizing silt on the land. Now, since they built the Aswan Dam, the Nile does not flood, and farmers have to irrigate and fertilize. Most of Egypt that's outside of Cairo live as they did in the 7th century, in mud brick houses using the age-old methods to raise their crops and cattle.
These vendors put Egyptian cotton fabrics in plastic bags and threw them up onto the top deck of the boat for us to look at.
Hey lady,
They were expert at throwing it just the right height. If you bought something, you sent the money down in the plastic bag. They were also expert at not getting caught. Whoops, you missed one, didn't you? And not getting crushed between the boats.
Okay. Now, as we were leaving lecture, it was like a boat caravan, but it was a race to see who would get to the locks first. You got to go through the locks on a first come, first served basis. And look how close we fit we were on the side to come through the locks.
In about 200 BC, the Greeks conquered Egypt. The next 3 temples we'll see were built by the Greeks and Egyptians. The Egyptians did not seem to mind the Greek rule because they ruled as the Egyptian pharaohs had and allowed them to build temples to their ancient gods. Edfu was the first of these temples. We had to take a kalacher or a carriage and horse ride to get there. These temples are some of the best preserved because they were buried under the sand and silt for 2,000 years. This shows how high the sand and silt was before the archaeologists began their work. The pillars show a combination of lotus and papyrus, representing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The roof resting on the pillars is Greek. Edfu was a temple built to Horus, the falcon god. popular for the unification of the nations. It was thought he avenged the murder of his father, Osiris, here. Interestingly, most of the gods had families and a family history. The outside pylon is 118 feet tall. The carved relief shows a Greek pharaoh defeating his enemies in front of the Egyptian gods, Horus and Hathor. Horus represented the unification of kingdoms, as I said before. The temple is laid out like the temples in Israel with the courtyard for, whoops. It's Bob's turn.
This temple is laid out like the temples in Israel with a courtyard for festivals, and behind the pillars were rooms that held offerings to the gods. Now here was evidence of early Christians used this temple. They rubbed out the faces and bodies of the gods in an attempt to stop worship to them. Now this Coptic or Egyptian Christians also made little altars out of some of the stonework. Here is a Coptic cross. This one happens to have Roman writing all around it. So it was most likely done after the Greek period under Roman rule.
In sharp contrast,
Oops, what happened to the other one?
I don't know.
Snowstorm.
I'll go on to this one.
Okay.
well, in sharp contrast, there was a huge statue of Horus. And he was in bird form, and he was like 6 feet tall. He could either be human, bird, or a winged disc. Only the priests were allowed back here into the sanctuary to care for Horus. Each year, the priest brought Horus's wife to him to visit.
A little further down the Nile, surrounded by fields of sugarcane and corn, we came to the imposing Greek temple of Umbo. It was unusual because it's built like a duplex, with 2 separate doors, 2 separate courtyards, 2 separate altars. One to Sobek, the crocodile god of creation, and one to Horus, the falcon god. You just stay on this one, Henry. In a Roman shrine, that's this, we found a mummified Nile crocodile. Whoops, that one didn't come out either. We actually had a picture of a mummified crocodile inside of a case. It didn't look much like a god, I'll tell you. Okay, this is Sobek, the god of creation. You can see he's got a human body, but a crocodile head. Go on, Henry.
This isn't good. Okay, hold on. Technical difficulties.
That's why we have her here.
Rick, any suggestions? Got that one.
How many are we missing, Henry?
Well, that's a really good question. Okay, can we take a 3-second break?
No, do you want a light? Give us a light song?
Shouldn't need that. Just need to wreck your show, I'm sorry, Mother. Let me see what we got.
Can I ask a question, Bob?
Yeah.
How do they read their writings? Is it straight down, across? Was it across?
Well, the Arabic language is read right to left,
Right to left?
but the Egyptian, you never knew.
You never knew.
No, you have
No,
to look at,
they could be read from, hieroglyphics could be read from the top to the bottom, from the left to right, or right to left.
Really?
yeah.
Yeah, so that's why they could have such a hard time understanding them. Any other questions while we wait to see if they can figure this out?
Alice,
Yes,
that mummy that we saw earlier, how old did they estimate him to be?
about 5,000 years.
He looked that.
so much is because
The
they were
gold.
all the gold.
One of the first pictures showed a quarter of beef.
Pardon me?
The meat hanging on a,
Oh, we're gonna get to that.
okay.
That's the festival of the slaughter of the lamb.
Ooh.
Well, my brother went to grab his laptop, we got prepared, we brought two, and we threw the program on a disc too, so we're just gonna try that.
But did your program not copy some of them, Ken?
I don't know what happened, so and I tested it before I left home, that's the frustrating part about it, yeah.
They can only do what you tell them to.
So,
We don't mind, this kind of thing has never happened with electronic equipment.
yeah,
He said this kind of thing has never happened.
no, no,
We're just gonna,
okay.
Send a dollar
Do
ninety-five
you,
with a
do
coupon.
you wanna keep going and see if, or do you wanna stop? See if this has it.
well, where are we at? Are we gonna do the same one around that?
There's quite a few missing if we go finish this up.
Oh, are there?
Let's see if we can swap PCs here.
That takes a long time to go.
Well, it won't, I've got it on the video. Just his computer has to start. Okay, so did anybody have any other questions on what we've already seen?
This is a good time to think about something you might have seen, because, it's gonna take a minute, I think, here.
Yeah, we were good right there, and then it just,
Yeah, I wonder what happened to the
New
new
lunch on Tuesday.
So you actually could go inside of these tombs?
Yes,
I mean, they're open to tourists. You
Yes,
can go inside.
some of them, you have to pay an
Most
additional
of you
fee.
had to be.
Yeah,
but just a little bit. I mean, it wasn't.
How'd you like the camel ride?
It was bumpy.
Were there no restrictions on using flash camera?
Oh, yeah.
oh yeah, there were a lot.
Inside a lot of the tombs, they said no. But we had a guide that had the rights to take pictures in the museum and a lot of the places where we couldn't, and he gave us his disc too. So we're able to pull some of his pictures, where we probably would not have been able to show them to you otherwise.
And then they let you use your camera phone.
With no flash.
With no flash. So some of those, the ones that are just a little bit blurry, are probably the camera phone ones that we did.
Just as long as you don't flash, huh?
Yeah.
What do you want to do here?
Well, it was all there. So, hopefully the DVDs got it.
Just one more minute. Almost there.
So how did the grandkids like it?
Oh,
Did they,
Yes.
In retrospect, they have, that's probably my problem. In retrospect, they loved it. There were a few moments during the trip. As with any teenage kid, hearing a lot about history, it was a bit of a challenge.
And getting up early in the morning was a lot like going to school.
Which they were real excited about. We're almost there. We're gonna see if it has it on it, and if it is, it'll just take me a second to swap out PCs and we'll keep going.
You were there when?
December 21 to 31 of last year.
Okay, what was the climate then?
About 70 in the daytime and down to 55 at night.
Oh, nice time.
It was a little warmer down by Luxor. We got down up into the 80s maybe down there.
is the Nile River very polluted or is it clean?
It didn't seem real polluted.
Didn't seem really that bad.
Jump drive from
It goes a long ways.
It's one of the longest rivers in the world.
It's
You know, if I do
4,000 and
this
some miles
Yeah,
long.
4,145 miles long, from Lake Victoria
Yes?
all the way to the Mediterranean. But we come to that later, Dodie.
Okay. Okay.
Later comes.
Right.
Extra percentage, huh?
two loaded TV, computers. One isn't working, the other one's back on.
Yeah, I'm wondering what happened to those pictures.
I don't know, they were all in my computer when she copied them, because
Well,
we got them all printed out on paper.
Oh, they can sneak off. Or just any little glitch can pop.
Oh, yeah. Murphy's Law.
Yes. Few more icons in our.
this is my works. So I heard somebody say mug shots.
Yeah.
I work in corrections, so there's a lot of corrections databases up there. Yeah, there's the jail, there's mug shots, there's sheriffs, there's statewide mugs, there's,
Yeah, see if we're on
you
there.
know, that would have to be another meeting for us.
Yeah, why don't you stand up and wiggle a minute? I promised 45 minutes, but we didn't plan for an intermission.
Okay,
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
okay, so we'll just, give us just a second.
Pudding commercial.
Does anybody have an exercise video?
I do not. Oh, classic. Memorize all those. No, maybe I'll just sit here. This is
Right over the edge, okay, where you can see it, line of sight. In fact, why don't you sit in front of me right against the wall? I got a perfect spot for you.
right next to you. How about
Right here, and then I'll scoot here and I can see right there, and you can see right there.
By the way, this is
Then Caroline's not going.
this is a friend of mine, Catherine. Exercise.
Yes, big. Hey, John. How are you?
started?
Oh, yeah, you told me
It was a
that.
very long day.
Yeah.
We had to keep the kids an extra 45 minutes to an hour. It was 45 minutes because of the tornado bad weather. So we had them a lot.
That'll take a few photos, so.
Right, right. Because of the tornado or something like that, it was kind of
That's only for a gig.
wherever. So they couldn't send the buses out.
No, it's not really. You'll accumulate some more.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Son so-and-so, well, their mother is here. Son so-and-so, their mother's here. Their dad is here. There it is. So, the mother's kids get them. Yeah, I mean, a lot of kids get picked up.
I don't know how to do it. So I can catch it up. That's quite a bit, isn't it, right there? Isn't that amazing? Well, that was on the old computer. And I wondered if I could hardly see some of those photos. Yeah, it looks like they're using
Yep. Yep. Little hike really long, 11 years ago.
Yes. Word, Excel, PowerPoint. No, that's not cheap.
There you go.
That's a lot. I mean, it's still enough, but yeah.
Kelly was born.
We're at the Apple Store in Ridgeville. It's the first Apple Store I've ever been in. You know, it's really pretty equipment. And then did you play with that new phone? Oh, you should. Yeah, we can see the ads on TV. Never choose that phone, you know.
Yeah.
It works just like it works. Okay.
It's dry. We're done with the stormy stuff.
Yes, I like it.
Look at photos.
No,
But I,
Internet, it'll get you the weather, it'll get you the stock exchange, it'll
that's it. Yeah. This is not your about the right time. Women's retreat right
it's a whole yeah, I bet she gets on there and so you're back
Talk about frustration, huh?
Well, Alice and I are technologically challenged, and that's why we brought them.
But you are, it's just one.
And so they were all there, but Tammy's like, well, here.
Fascinating. I've always been fascinated by YouTube. I used to do a lot.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right.
In fact, I have a book on Tutankhamun's tomb. You might be interested in it. You probably got to read it.
Yeah, we show more of them.
Yeah. I always had mixed feelings about Mr. Nick's tomb when they went in and took it apart. And I thought,
There you go.
So, all out there. It's one way to learn about it, obviously, but still.
Well, good.
Yes.
I thought they were there. I like the
Can you go ahead?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
It wouldn't be.
I mean, that's built into the operating system.
I don't know what the problem is.
Rob isn't. No, he doesn't. He can.
My daughter's son is this all.
You get a book or what did you get? Oh, it's an iMac. How big's the screen? Now, is this a laptop or a desktop? Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, 21-inch screen.
Now they got a whole new system.
Then they don't look as good.
So,
I just need my camera.
she's gonna learn this whole total management.
That's right.
Entire district.
Every now and then I take a picture. I just want a piece of it. And when you start to blow that up, unless you got all of your pixels, it's just not good. I have 7 meg.
Hard is it? Oh, I don't think it's hard. It's just to get all the data in there.
A lot of them are
So
7
being
meg.
that I was the one that kind of messed up things, because I thought I checked this well, we're gonna ask a big favor. We're gonna work on a couple of different options, both my brother and I, on the getting things running. In the interim, my mom has gone to great endeavors to have you taste authentic Egyptian food. So what we're gonna ask is that we'd like you all to come back, but take a break, go enjoy some food, give us a chance to work on this, and then come back here for the second half to find out what the splendor of what you were eating is all about. So please come back, just give us a little bit of time, we'll touch base with you there.
So this is like an interview?
There you go, good. We'll get it out.
So you stored all your
Are you down for the count? I am. Shall we just bring yours in? It's like a card. I don't blame you.
Play with it.
I know, I'll play. I did.
Oh, John,
You can have
you made the right choice. You just needed a little, what you were doing, you just required some more resources.
That's good.
One of these days, I gotta come over and see your new edition. 2 hours? I think about
Pastor, what's the price of these books? $6. Oh, $6. Well,
Dave, we got these books. A little slip in each one. Cost is $6. So you won't have to be talking about a lot of do you have a group?
no. Yeah. You can always know your relationship's going. Keep your eyes on him, Patrick, keep your eyes on him. Gigi says he's bowing out. They're going to put together pretty neat. What's winter quarter.
Putting the nursing home, the VA nursing home.
It's on the Jeff Drive, yeah.
Health conditions are not what I call typical.
Oh,
I thought it was interesting because he went to his
oh,
specialist
okay.
attorney.
You gotta go there.
And he explained that
You want me to go get
some special
Wes?
attorney
Okay.
that specializes in this.
Sounds like a good idea.
He got everything put into his name legally he was able to do so. Before he was ready.
Because of her condition.
Because I know you don't like the one.
Yeah.
All I should need is the towel.
We have done it. Because otherwise John says,
That's all I got. All I need is the towel.
because I said, there's no way I'm gonna tell Norm. It's not
Yeah, I know all I need is the towel.
No. He knows my brother, no. Okay. Well, you can let me know on Sunday. Okay, thank you, I appreciate that.
Well, it's been here
No, we
10 or a few minutes later. That'll give us some time to make it easy trip.
No.
See, the problem is I think the speed at which it can transfer the data up in Xerox now. USB 2.0 or 1. This is, I don't think this one is. This is going much faster. Once it's got the hardware, I think we're going to
I'm tired, believe it or not, despite this little endeavor.
I'd probably drop over dead.
Yeah, I feel bad for my mom. She's pushing hard on me.
And I thought, okay, I'm supposed to go out tonight for
look at the
dinner or whatever. I thought, okay, there's no way I'm gonna use that.
whatever you burn.
But it's almost time.
It's recalculated.
Yep. As it goes, it keeps thinking about it.
And
Like a dial-up connection. It starts off fast.
we get the originals on the only other thing I could do is, once you get moved, I could take the jump drive and run back over that here. Yep, for some reason it sounds like.
You know what I'm saying?
Just go get the towel. And the towel.
Assuming the house is open. expensive e-machine for my father for emailing and pictures and things. You can't find a new computer with XP on it anymore, they're all this stuff, so. But yeah, XP with the Service Pack 2 that's a pretty solid system now. Yeah. It's really solid.
I started playing around with ATs, XTs, 280s, well, even before
286,
before
yeah.
286s. 8086s. We had two big floppy drives, and you put your big floppy drive in, you load the operating system, and you take it out and put it in another disk with your program. That's when I got started playing around with them. Playing around with them ever since. 3.1 was a very stable system, but that's because it wasn't really a system, it was just DOS.
Right.
And then Windows 95 was so-so. 98 was a little better. ME was a disaster.
Rick, you have any luck?
Yeah, it's looking promising now.
It's looking promising, good.
You know what I forgot to do is turn off the camera. Well, that's interesting.
It's almost already all over, isn't it?
Well,
Cloud Campus.
It's a deli.
It's a deli, but they do Egyptian, Muslim, Islam food, and they have those students there that they take care of, and they were so helpful. And so, anyway, if you ever go in there, just say, hey, we tasted some of this.
Okay, if we can have your attention, we'll continue where we didn't have any pictures. We have them now.
All right.
Okay, this is the one I was talking about that wasn't there, and you can see it is built like a duplex. There's two doors, and there's two separate courtyards, one out here and one out here. And this is one where Sobek, the crocodile god of creation, and there's another room in there with Horus, the falcon god. Okay, now we can go on, and this little small room is of Roman construction, and in there we found this mummified Nile crocodile, but we didn't think it looked like a god. Okay, now this was Sobek again, the god of creation in the human form with the crocodile head. And this is Horus, the falcon god, representing the unification of the kingdoms. This is the temple calendar. Okay, now for some reason, all of these faces, their warriors were destroyed, but their names are up here in those cartouches up on top, they call them.
Down below.
Nope, they're right there,
Yes.
yep, right along there. That tells who they are. Okay, now this was interesting. The priests were always saying how they could predict the rise and fall of the Nile River. They didn't tell them they could look down in this cistern and see with a piece of wood floating there how if the river was coming up or going down.
So it was a direct tunnel right to the Nile.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
The last night on the Nile River, we had an ancient Egyptian dress-up night. We got to stand as we came walking up the step, and there was Japanese contingent there, and all the ladies wanted their picture taken with us. Our Egyptian guide wore a traditional Egyptian work robe. He wanted his picture taken with the women. Daughter Tammy and her husband Mike.
Wasn't happy about that, by the way.
This is our granddaughter, Allison. She played, and during the evening we had a really fun time. We played Egyptian group games, we danced Egyptian dances, and had a fun evening. Islam doesn't allow any alcohol, drugs, gambling, or immodest dress, but we had a great time.
Okay, now there'd be no trip to Egypt would be complete without a trip on these 3,000-year-old design boats called the felucas. The ancient sailing boats cruise the Nile throughout the day, and they're booked many times for sunset tours. Sailing was so quiet because, of course, there was no motors. Go ahead, Dan. Some tourists sail much of the Nile on these feluccas. They stop and see the temples and so on as they go along the Nile in that.
Next, we took a boat to the island of plants on Aswan. The girls were ready for a break from the temples. The Egyptians gave this island to a British general who led the Egyptian army in successful campaigns in Sudan. He lived there and covered it with exotic plants imported from all over the world. It was one of the most beautiful places I've seen. Besides the cats, there were colorful birds, egrets, and among the coconut and date palms. As we were ready for a break, I sat there and wondered, I'll bet the Garden of Eden looks something like that.
Okay, next we went over to the Aswan Dam. And the Aswan Low Dam was originally built by the British to regulate the flow of the Nile, and so increased Egypt's cultivable land and provide hydroelectric power. Then the High Dam, which you see here, was built by the Soviet Union and made this Lake Nasser, they call it, which is over 300 miles long. But it sounds great, but the rising water table displaced 800,000 Egyptians. It's destroying the ancient monuments, and silt formerly deposited in the delta is now all retained in Lake Nasser, forcing Egypt's farmers to use harmful chemicals. Now here goes the Nile as it's heading for the Mediterranean, but the Nile starts in Ethiopia, in Lake Victoria, and goes all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, some 4,145 miles to make it one of the longest rivers in the world.
The last temple we'll visit is the Temple of Philae. It's one of the temples that would have been lost with the building of the High Dam. It took over 10 years to move it piece by piece. It was an international organization that did it.
Oh, wow.
Built in the late Greek and early Roman periods, the huge temple combines ancient Egyptian and Greek-Roman architecture. Again, we saw the Greek pharaohs massacring enemies watched by the Egyptian gods. This is an 1800s picture of the inside of Temple Philae. It shows how high the floodwaters got before it was removed up to the top of the pillars, the dark spots. This is the moved and restored Temple of Philae. These are some of the carved reliefs. The Greek pharaohs offering sacrifices and praises to the Egyptian gods, Hathor and Horus. Holding your hands out in front, like I said, seemed to be a sign of praise. A close-up of the goddess of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and pleasure. Note the big cow ears so that she could hear people's prayers. There was a small Greek column temple in Philae, and this is where the last hieroglyphics seem to have been written, at least it's the latest ones that have been found. This was an Egyptian Christian altar made from a sarcophagus in the Philae temple. Notice the Egyptian or Coptic cross. We saw many sites like this hidden in the temples and tombs. The early Egyptian Christians built these little altars when Christianity was outlawed in the Roman Empire, and later too. But anyway, so many people tried to stamp out Christianity in Egypt. This was in the 1st century AD. The kids are all templed out. Are you?
Okay, the next stop we made was kind of unusual because so many people have wondered how and where on earth did the Egyptians get these stones to build all their temples? Well, here we visited a quarry used to carve the perfectly shaped stones out of solid rock. An unfinished obelisk was found here that weighed 2.3 million pounds. You'll see that it was cracked. So that made it unusable, but it shows us how the huge stones were cut for the temples and how they were built, and they actually had a way of putting sand underneath these as they were digging them out and rolling them out onto the sand, putting them onto logs, rolling them down to the Nile on the logs, and floating them to the area where they had the construction project.
Egypt has always been a very religious nation. It's now 94% Islam and 6% Coptic Christians. There are about 200 Jews there. That certainly wasn't true thousands of years ago. As we saw, the ancient Egyptian religion was to worship many gods. One pharaoh tried to change that and deemed worship to one god, the Amun-Re, the sun god, but he and his ideas were destroyed in about 1200 BC. Before Christ, Egypt's conquerors respected the religious traditions of Egypt, even though they had political control, and the Egyptians didn't seem to mind when the Greeks were in control. Then in the 1st century AD, Mark, who they call St. Mark, introduced Christianity into Egypt. We were told Egypt was one of the first countries to accept Christianity, as they believed in life after death and virgin birth. Many of the early Egyptian Christians were martyred under Roman rule, as was Mark in Alexandria. As you remember, he was dragged to death. This is one of the oldest Christian churches in Cairo. But Christianity spread. Oh, we need the one of the disciples. Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, and eventually it was adopted as the official language, as the official religion in Egypt. This is a mosaic of Jesus' ascension in about 300 AD. The disciples are at the left, and the other people are at the right.
Okay, here there were theology differences between the Roman Christians and the Egyptian or Coptic Christians, and the Copts were mercilessly persecuted. The Eastern Christians, or Byzantines, remained in power until the 7th century. Many of those early churches still survive, and we'll have 3 pictures coming up of those churches.
Then following.
Yeah, I should probably go into this other part too.
Do you want me to go back or what?
Yeah, go back. Then following the teachings of Muhammad in the 7th century, the army of Islam defeated the Byzantines in battle, and they entered Egypt, and Egypt became a province of an already vast Islamic empire. For a while there were great numbers of Coptic Christians. Then in the 11th century, Egyptians, aware of the immense material advantages of assimilating with the other Arab countries, converted en masse to Islam, though the Coptic churches were not outlawed or forbidden, and they still survive. Now, the inscription that Tammy was just showing back there was found in front of a Greek Orthodox church. And I'll go on. Okay, right behind the hanging church, which is Coptic Christian, we found the Ben Ezra Synagogue. This is called the Hanging Church. It's one of the oldest churches in Egypt, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was built on the water gate of an old Roman fortress of Babylon. This Coptic cross was found in a window of the Hanging Church.
This plaque is of St. George, who was executed because he would not renounce Christ. He was a Christian martyr. And now they have a church that we saw after we walked down to where Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were to have stayed. It was too dark down there to get a good picture. But this is the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George. It's the largest Greek Orthodox church in all of Egypt. I never thought I'd go to an Islam mosque. It was interesting to visit the mosque, however. Women had to be covered and in a different section than the men. The idea, they said, was so that we wouldn't distract the men. Their translated prayer, they did translate, our Egyptologists did translate the prayers for us, and they did sound like the Psalms. And the Old Testament, the first part of it, the Islam, Jews, and Christians seem to be pretty much in agreement, but up to a point. As you know, they pray 5 times a day, wherever they are. But Egypt has preserved Coptic Christianity in its culture in the context of a Muslim nation for centuries. However, recently, the radical Islamic fundamentalists are pushing for more power. There seems to be a hotbed of fundamentalists at the university, and they keep them guarded, but the radical Islamists are gaining more seats in Parliament all the time. So pray for.
Okay, we can kind of read this one. The streets of Cairo were getting ready for a feast, and after fasting several days, on the evening of the 29th, the gifts were given, a big meal was served to the family. Now, we went into the outskirts of Cairo, the next slide, Tammy, and seeing all this excitement. Everyone gets new clothes at New Year's. Now, they did have a celebration going on called Eid al-Adha, and this is a festival of the slaughtering of the lambs, and you can see the lambs have red paint on them here. They're marked for slaughter. Now, they
And
will
sacrifice.
and sacrifice, but they will be split 3 ways. A third to the poor, a third to the family and friends, and a third to the owner. It was interesting to note that the Muslims give 2 to 3% of their total wealth to the mosque every year. Now, there were carts like this of all kinds of food filling the streets. They don't have much in the way of refrigeration, though. We drove side by side with donkeys and wagons carrying these wares down the streets. Then we took some short side trips, one of which was to Memphis. Now, they had to move this huge statue of Ramses II. He was standing by the rail station in Cairo, and the pollution was getting to him. So they brought him into the museum here in Memphis, and he's much safer here.
You read about alabaster jars with women and Jesus drinking from alabaster jars. We saw alabaster being made. They're paper thin, beautiful, but they're from stone. And this is an alabaster shop. We decided they were just too heavy to bring home. This is an example of an Egyptian shopping center. Notice the alabaster shop, and we also went to a perfume shop. We have some samples of perfume out on the table out there.
Okay, next we were very fortunate to watch them make papyrus the same way they did 5,000 years ago. And the following 3 pictures are some of the Egyptian paintings that are done on papyrus, and look how brilliant they are.
They actually take the reeds and pound them and weave them and run them through a roller and then paint on them. We have some samples out on the table.
Isn't that one beautiful?
As a New Year's gift to us,
That's it, Bob.
okay,
As a New Year's gift to us, our guide gave us each a papyrus painting. You'll notice that Alice got the Key of Life, and I got a harem.
the Cairo Museum was one of the highlights of our trip. There was just so much there. If grave robbers hadn't taken everything from the tomb, most of the items were left here. This is a view of the outside of the museum, and the papyrus garden, lotus garden, in front of the museum.
And then as we went in the door, we found over the doorway this painting of a warrior. And this is the highly decorated storage box from King Tut's tomb. The gold leaf decoration was as fine as any that had ever been seen.
It's the relief carving of Queen Nefertiti giving an offering to Cyrus, the god of the underworld. Setting statues of a pharaoh and his queen. The main exhibit hall, you could stand and look up 3 floors or look down 3 floors. Everything was so mammoth and monumental that it was easy to see things from
This is the gold inlaid chair from King Tut's tomb. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Now, this was interesting, I thought. They intricately carved all these soldiers, and they were buried with the pharaoh, so he would have protection. Okay, this brings us to the end of this tour. And we just have a couple closing comments. As we left Egypt, a number of thoughts crossed our minds.
It was hard to fathom what man could do 5,000 years ago, isn't it? The pyramids, the beautiful stone carvings, the artwork, the paintings, they've all lasted 5,000 years. The gold leaf is as exquisite as anything done today. I thought, what a powerful argument against intellectual evolution.
The modern Sunni Muslims in Egypt had to be admired for making their faith their total way of life. And yet, they have learned to live side by side with the Egyptian or Coptic Christians and have a democratic government.
How moving it was to see and feel the roots of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The Muslims talk about Abraham and Moses like they were there just yesterday, especially during their festival. The Old Testament just comes alive in Egypt.
We wondered why man seems to have always searched for a God. Some of them found false gods to worship. Is mankind wired to believe there is a God? Or was our living God paving the way for Mary, Joseph, and Jesus? An age-old question.
We'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.